Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vickie Lan, and in each episode, I and a guest will unpack a trope with an eye for world building, character development, or narrative structures. You can also join the conversation on TikTok and Instagram. For those times when the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Okay, Neal, have you ever wanted to go back in time and fix something from your past so that you'd have a better present?
Oh, absolutely. Of course.
Yeah? What, anything that
Oh
comes to mind
man.
specifically?
Wow, your icebreaker. I was expecting like, in the past we've done like, what's your favorite tea or whatever. This is like potentially very personal.
Oh God. Okay, I'll give you one. I'll give you an easy
Okay.
one. I wish that I could go back in time and tell myself to start using a mouth guard sooner because a lot
Oh,
of my nerve pain in my neck is from clenching my teeth, and I didn't know that in
sure.
my sleep. So I'm like, that is a situation. You know, how people say I wouldn't want to go back in time and fix anything because life is about the lessons you learn along the way. And I'm like, oh, if I could honestly make my life better, just a little bit better, by something as silly as simple as a mouth guard. Anyway.
Absolutely. And that makes me think of one. So, I bought a condo in about 2007, right
Uh-huh.
before the housing market crashed, and it
Oh.
lost about 40% of its value over the course of just a few months.
Oof.
And I was young. I was so briefly out of college, and I had people older than me being like, "Oh, well, if you don't have to rent, then don't rent. Renting is throwing away money. If you can
Mm-hmm.
buy, like, buy." And it was a humongous financial mistake.
Oh, I,
So that's mine.
I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that share that same regret and wish they can go back and fix that.
Hmm.
I feel like some of that's happening right now, actually, where especially with the fluctuation of the housing market right now. So, all right. Well, Neal, I'm so excited to have you back on here again. I feel like we've talked about some pretty heavy hitters in the past, specifically or most memorably AI and its ramifications. This time we're talking about time loops. So, Neal, before we get started, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, hello. My name is Neal Holtschulte. I am a fiction author. I have one novel out that's called Crew of Exiles. It's not about time travel at all, time loops. But I'm so happy to be talking about this topic. When you asked for ideas of like, what might you like to talk about? This one, it was right away. I was like, time loops, and you were like, awesome. And so
Hmm.
I'm happy to be here.
On my list of ideas, actually, I had time loops on there, but I called it doom loops. And I'm curious,
Hmm.
do you look at time loops the same way in that pessimistic view that I initially wrote it down, or are you more optimistic in your view of time loops?
Um, I would say optimistic,
Okay.
but and I think it'll come out as we start discussing. But I'm gonna mention a little bit about a work in progress that I have that features a time loop, and it's much more on the doom side. So that's
Okay.
interesting. But no, I see time loops as largely like a power fantasy. Like you get to go back and like correct everything and do things right and like figure it all out.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Okay.
partly based on the examples that, maybe I've been reading or viewing most recently.
Okay. Well, I'd love to hear your examples. I'll share one first just to explain why I called it a doom loop. The Flash movie, the recent Flash movie with Ezra Miller, he gets stuck in a doom loop when okay, backing up even more. The Flash can run really fast. The Flash can enter time travel, okay?
For those of you who don't know anything about the Flash, he's
Yes.
fast.
He's just really fast. Okay, he runs really fast. I'm sure I'm minimizing a lot of it. So, I'm sorry. Anyway, he had a moment in his life that he wishes that he can fix. Right, his mother ends up getting murdered by a home invader, and so in this movie, he chooses to go back in time to prevent that from happening. And what ultimately, and I'm going to be spoiling some of it, but I want to explain why I consider it a doom loop, is he gets trapped in this obsessive cycle of trying to prevent it because it never actually truly gets prevented. Like something worse happens or something like, and he ends up becoming like this monster, the very monster that's trying to like stop him from entering the, and of course my memory's a little bit faded on this now. Ultimately, after you discover that, how he becomes this deranged creature from failure, essentially, he realizes he cannot undo this. If he keeps trying, he's going to be stuck in this terrible state. So he goes back, repairs the timeline, essentially ensuring that his mother's going to get killed, and then he can return back to the normal timeline. To me, I saw that as a doom loop. And the point of it was you can't change the past, I guess. What are your examples?
So, and before I just sort of list some of my examples, treat my example list, any listeners, as um, minor spoilers. I hope to keep it very minor in terms of the spoiling and certainly avoid like endings and major plot points. But, inevitably, there's definitely some stuff going to come out. So my complete list that I could think of, Groundhog Day,
Hmm.
the movie Edge of Tomorrow, and the novel that it's based on, All You Need Is Kill. Um, the video game The Outer Wilds, which is an incredible experience if you've never played it before. The TV show, I think it's Netflix, Russian Doll, is also a total kick in the head in a good way. And then my wife and I dug out from like the box DVD set or whatever, an episode of Lois and Clark, the 90s TV show.
Oh, okay.
Twas the Night Before Mixmas, which is a classic time loop in just a single episode, and it is delightfully campy, as anyone who's watched that TV show knows the whole TV show is.
Hmm. Oh, I love that. Okay, I had some of that on mine too. I had Groundhog Day, Edge of Tomorrow, a rom-com that came out a couple years ago, Palm Springs, starring Andy Samberg.
Yeah, I actually thought about watching it in preparation for this, and I just didn't get to it. I just watched
Okay.
I
It's
I
cute. I
did.
mean, there's so many great things about it. The actors are fantastic and it's a fun, lighthearted look at the Groundhog Day premise.
Mhm.
And then some other examples was Doctor Strange fighting Dormammu. He traps him in a time loop and they can't, defeats him that way. There's a book called Seven and a Half Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. Now, some people have argued that this isn't traditional because there's a set ending. There's like a time, there's like a they have to do something in a certain deadline, but it feels like a time loop when you're
Mhm.
reading it because you're keep repeating the same day from different perspectives. And there's I'm almost afraid to say this because it could be a spoiler for some, so I'll just say there's a Stephen King book series that is ultimately a time loop. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know that one, no.
Okay. All right. Well, maybe I won't say anything further, but people get invested into it, and then the very ending of the book reveals that you're right at the beginning. So,
Oh yeah, okay. So probably don't. Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
maybe
I
I'll
don't know
check.
how much we're gonna spoil today. It's
All right. So, what is the purpose of a time loop in fiction? Why do we use them? What are they for?
um I think that what's great about time loops is that they can be for so many things. They fit sort of our at least our modern narrative structure so well. I think that part of it is that time loops are actually quite relatable in most circumstances because uh, our daily lives is a lot of repetition of the same things we've done in previous days. But the way many time loops are presented, there's this fantasy appeal as well of we get to correct our mistakes. We get to live out the things that we normally just fantasize about as if only I had done this instead. Right.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, as I said, I'm seeing it as more of optimistic time loops. I hadn't thought about the Flash. I've consumed at least enough Flash media I knew what you were talking about, even though I haven't seen that particular movie.
Sorry then for spoiling it a little bit.
No, no, no. That's really okay. No. And the other thing I want to say about why we use these time loops is, and I want to attribute this to Brandon Sanderson, but I might be wrong on that. I'm pretty sure it's something he talks about on one of the Writing Excuses episodes, which is a at least famous to writers podcast where he and others discuss writing and give writing advice.
Mhm.
But in one of those episodes, I'm pretty sure that's where it's from. he describes how a premise should be ordinary and extraordinary. And
Okay.
time loops are a perfect example of this, right? They are ordinary in that our daily lives, they are time loops, right? Our daily lives, they repeat, right? In some senses, it can be this horrible, tedious, frustrating, get up, sit in traffic, work, sit in traffic again, do chores, go to sleep, repeat. Like it can be that like misery. Um, but also, and I think looking at the time loops in a more positive fashion, we can think about like, okay, I did make a mistake yesterday. I have tomorrow. And tomorrow's going to be mostly the same, except hopefully I can correct this mistake. And of course, in, various different media, there's the extra part of it where it's not the regular day over and over and over again. It's some special day, right? Groundhog Day, even though, especially for a lot of that movie, he's sort of like, oh, this is terrible. I'm stuck in this small town. Everybody's obsessed with this silly groundhog ceremony that I hate. But it is a special day. It's Groundhog Day. It wouldn't work if it was just some arbitrary day. It's got to be that day. And every time loop story has something that's special about what does repeat and how it gets to repeat. And there's little details that are different, which is why I think they're so consumable and so writable and readable and filmable.
So when you decide to enter the sphere of time loops as a writer, you decide to make that decision. And I think that your perspective I'm really going to value because you made that choice in your current work in
Mhm.
progress.
Yeah.
Are you doing it to explore personal development of the character? Is it a survival based environment? What kind of what tools does it basically put in your lap when you decide to go down that route?
hmm Um, I mean, certainly most of the examples that I can think of, it is character stories, and I'm attracted to character stories. I want to write character stories. That's what I'm all about. Um, and I think the time loops are good for that because they have sort of at least suggested, again, we want to have variation and we want to have variety, but there's at least sort of a suggested arc to one's response to the time loop. And I actually wrote this out just to sort of organize my own thoughts. And it's sort of of course, surprise, shock or fear potentially. And then there's like a denial rejection stage. It's almost like stages of grief. And then there's like an acceptance manipulation stage, like, oh, I could turn this to my advantage. Often then there's followed by some sort of like power tripping part of it.
Right,
But
because there's no
eventually,
consequences, right? At first.
well, in many of them, right. In many time loop stories, there's no consequences. And then there's like maybe a boredom, tedium phase, or there's like a squeeze. There's like something that happens that makes it where like, oh gosh, I can't just like play around forever. I actually have to like figure something out. And then of course there's typically the breaking out of the time loop at the end, having grown as a person and learned my lesson, right?
So it's like a hero's journey, but in a time loop.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly the media that I've been consuming on time loops has also, I think, been inspired by or at least been in the lived in the ambiance of the hero's journey being such a powerful storytelling device.
Hmm. Well, what's really interesting is, and I just finished the an episode called Anti-Heroes, where we kind of dived really deep into the hero story in relation to anti-heroes. But the anti-hero cycle hinges on the idea that you are departing from someplace and entering a new sphere and discovery and all that stuff that comes with it. But in the event of a time loop, you are inward. You're turning inward a little bit more. You're examining your current existing conditions, maybe kind of picking them apart more and looking at it from a totally different angle. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think it really it makes a character look at what are the daily decisions that I'm making? How am I spending my time? Um, I think, we look at how we spend our time maybe differently if we have the appearance of infinite time in many time loops.
Hmm.
But also, Groundhog Day or other stories, it really makes you look at, these mundane interactions that can have a ballooning impact, and you can sort of see how things would be different if I was kinder or whatever in some particular interaction, right?
Yeah. Well, in the case of the Flash movie, the time loop is a reflection on grief and the looping
Mm,
you do in your own head, right? So
mm,
you lose a loved one and it's devastated your life, and you are constantly in a state of mourning and revisiting your life with them, without them, with them, without them, you know what I mean? And grief usually requires a degree of acceptance to move on and break out of that mindset, which is kind of exactly what the Flash did in that movie. So I do think it's in the psychological reflections that we have. We're looking internally, basically, when we are establishing a time loop story. What thoughts do you have about our psyches as we develop and create time loops as a writer? What are we pulling from?
So, at a basic level, all of our time measurements and systems are based on cycles, whether it's day-night cycle, it's the year cycle. I mean, they're all literally rotations of
Hmm.
the Earth, Earth around the sun. So again, gets back to the relatability of a time loop. Like we understand a time loop because we kind of exist in them already. So your psyche, I mean, I think it's such a great premise. So your psyche, I think, is ready to dive into this premise. And I love what you said also about the idea that they're I forget exactly how you phrased it, but I'm going to rephrase it as it's nostalgia, it's regret, it's dwelling on the past. It's all these things that are deeply ingrained with potentially grief or just regret, just decisions that we made, or things we wish we could go back to. So I think it's a really rich territory for authors to explore.
Hmm. A morality question for you. What
Hmm.
would you do in the absence of consequences? What do you think real life humans would do outside of fiction?
Oh, in the absence of consequences, I
Yeah.
mean, oof. I'm not sure I have a lot of faith that in the absence of consequences, like I think that one of the things that makes Groundhog Day really great, because from a certain perspective, he's such a trash human being. And when I watched it for the first time, which was relatively recently, I was like, oh my God, this guy's so unlikable. Like, I just really hate him. Um, and also from a modern perspective, it's like, wow, he's so inappropriate in taking advantage of these people. Um, but I think that what makes the movie defensible, maybe redeemable even, is how he does grow as a character and how I think that I hope that, or at least, that movie also sort of has this hopeful perspective that um, a person, while they might first sort of explore all the uh, vices that they can uh, experience without consequence, that is a very shallow existence, and that would get very boring if that's literally all you had over and over and over again. And at some point, you would want to explore how can I live sort of a more fulfilling life that is fulfilling for myself and also fulfilling for the people around me.
Hmm.
And so I do think and I hope that that's eventually where people would go. And I mean, me personally, I would admit I would definitely indulge in vices if there were no consequences, more so. And but I also think that I hope that I would eventually be like, okay, it's time now to move beyond that and explore what benefit we can gain from this time loop that I happen to be stuck in.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's launch into this next section that I have here, which is discussing fate versus free will.
Hmm.
So, especially how time loops come into play. So, how do loops address questions of fate and agency, basically, the character's ability to have the free will to go after something. Are characters truly making choices, or are they doomed to repeat the same outcomes no matter what they do?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I'm not exactly sure how you're interpreting that question and how I might be interpreting it differently. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this as well. But I would say that the individual who's looping, who usually in such stories has awareness of the loop and can learn from past loops, that person has agency, certainly in a storytelling sense. But a typical conceit of the loop is that other people are unaware and they are sort of um, determined in their behavior. Now, of course, they can respond differently to the looper who has presented them with a different prompt than in the previous loop. But I think that there's an interesting thing that in what I've been consuming doesn't really get addressed that much, which is a certain desensitization. Like it's there, it's just not like a core part. So in absolutely in Groundhog Day and in Edge of Tomorrow, there are very explicitly scenes or sections of the film that are emphasizing to the viewer that this person is totally desensitized to the lives of the people around him and he has no respect for their lives. Um, because I'm not sure why. It doesn't necessarily delve into it. We can sort of have our own thoughts about that, whether it's because he doesn't see them as real people, which I think is a real danger if
Hmm.
they seem like automatons. They seem like they're not changing in any way day to day. But of course, how could they? Because for them, it's not a loop. Um, and also just because of the fact that he has seen the same day so many times. The repetition is numbing.
Hmm. That's a really interesting point you bring up because there's a danger to time loops for your characters. The desensitization is very real. Um, Going back a bit and addressing what you questioned about how I interpreted this. When it comes to agency, I guess depending on what story this time loop is trying to serve, in some cases I feel like a time loop is just a puzzle. And the joy is watching the main character break his way out of a puzzle. And of course, there's some self growth that has to come with it. In the case of the Flash, it's about overcoming a grief cycle. But as far as fate and agency and making choices and feeling like they're doomed to repeat the same outcomes, I do think it reflects real life feelings of agency when you feel trapped in a cycle of that is not of your own making. So a good example of this would be intergenerational trauma and how you could at some point in your life choose to acknowledge that while you are affected by your life circumstances and that it's passed down to you and there's like nature and nurture working against you, you still have the ability to kind of come to terms with it. And literally, the term is break the cycle. And I find that that tends to happen depending on how people, authors, writers are choosing to use their time loops. There's a point where they kind of figure out how to break that cycle. And usually the agency and the fate like is tied to that moment. Unless, of course, it's just a really sad, twisted story where you never break out, something out of like Twilight Zone or something where you never break out of it. And that's just the point of it is that doom and gloom. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's my thought.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The stuff that I've seen, it culminates. I mean, it's a natural culmination is to break out of the time loop at
Mhm.
the end. And uh, I think, yeah, so many of our experiences that we resonate with, these, cycles of trauma, um, and like you said, breaking out of the cycle. Like it's such a powerful metaphor, time loops are.
Mhm.
Because we're talking about fate and how hard it is to sort of um, change our fate, right? I mean, that's kind of what this is about. So my work in progress, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it right now because I think it's relevant. So my twist that I came up with is that the protagonist is not one of the individuals who loops. For him, the time loopers appear. They announce themselves as this is our power. We have been in this time before, and we are gonna, come save the world. Um, it's gonna be somewhat a military science fiction in that respect. And so they appear, they're gonna save the world. They fail. They're like, peace out. I guess that was good practice. We're gonna try again in another loop. Bye. But then everybody else's life just goes on. And
Oh.
and they're just like, oh shoot. Uh well, the people who've seen the future say that we're all doomed. What do we do next? Now, of course, I've ruined the surprise twist in my own story, but it's a work in progress. And like, I have like 75% of a first draft done. So it's like, it's going to be, anyway,
Yeah,
it's
it's
going to
gonna
be a long
change.
time.
Yeah, it'll evolve. Yep.
Um, Time enough for anyone who sees this to absolutely forget that I said that. So that's my premise and starting point. And so it's a lot of question of fate and of what control do we have and what can we do differently. Now, in my particular story, I'm going to have it where the loops are ever so slightly imperfect. So it's not just like the absolutely rigid, everything happens exactly the same. Or rather, in my particular case, everything does happen exactly the same, except that the people who are time looping, they can't reenact perfectly what they did on the previous time loops, which sort of has like a minor butterfly effect where things aren't going to
Okay.
go exactly as they necessarily plan, but they're going to keep practicing it and they sort of abandon everyone. I mean, in some ways they're antagonists. I don't know if antagonist is the right word. They're allies who then give up and abandon everyone. Betrayers, I guess. Um, and sort of what happens with everyone who moves on. I don't know. This premise struck me when, well, it struck me and it struck me again and again as I consumed more of this time loop media because occasionally, and I'm thinking of films at this point, there will be a scene where the time loop should be triggered and the camera will just like keep recording to get like a reaction shot from the other characters for some reason or whatever. And I find those exceptionally distracting and like I found them like existentially worrisome and painful because I was like, dude, that implies that all of these loops are like separate timelines that are going forward. And that means that all these people are having just a horrible time because of your awful behavior, you stupid protagonist before you've had your character arc. And I was like, okay, I need to write that story. I need to write the story of like, the time loopers haven't advanced to the next level. They haven't had their character arc. They're still assholes.
Oh,
And
wow.
and so the other characters are just like, well, damn, that was weird. And I'm distraught because these people who seem to know the future have told me that we're all doomed. And what do I do next? How do I
So
move on from that?
are you okay? So I was going to ask this later, but I'll move it up because I'm interested in this. So when you are writing any kind of time loop story, or any of our listeners that are thinking about doing it or currently writing it, I feel like in order for there to be an effective story, like all stories, there needs to be foreshadowing, little nuggets, the what do they call it? The loaded gun idea. If you
Yeah.
see a loaded gun at the beginning, it's got to go off in act three. How, to me, time loops are a huge puzzle, and I feel like writing one is a puzzle in and of itself. So how do you even begin? Where do you start? Like, how do you keep notes? Do you jot down where, okay, remember to put this item over here because you're going to recall it later over here, and what version of the time loop are you in, So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, my time loop. So I'm going to talk about time loops in general because my time loop story honestly isn't that typical
Okay.
because like in the story itself, nothing actually repeats. It's
Okay.
just these other people are like, hey, no, we've been here before. Believe us, and we'll prove it to you because we know what you're going to do next. And
Hmm.
so mine's like, I don't have to worry about typical time loop stuff because my story is actually linear. It's just about other people time looping.
Okay.
So anyway, um, but with if you're doing a time loop where there is actually a loop, you have to write like sort of the same thing happening over and over again. I think very careful consideration of what is the day, the event, you know, make sure it is some scenario typically packed with interesting things that can happen in a small time period.
Hmm.
Most days, or well, I don't know about most, but the time loops that I've read about are typically around the range of 24 hours because, of course, that is a time loop that we all exist in. So it
Yeah.
makes sort of mental sense. Um, I think that you need to think about what are the particulars of your time loop. Is it a perfect loop, or is there some way in which it can go a little bit astray? Um, Russian Doll is, and I watched it relatively recently. My wife was like, "You're gonna love this. You have to see it." And I was like, "Oh, okay. I don't know. I don't know anything about it." And like, if I haven't heard anybody praising it, it just comes out of nowhere. I'm like, I don't know if it's any good. Blew my frickin' mind. If people haven't seen Russian Doll, you got to give it a chance. Obviously, no particular medium is for everyone all the time. Some people won't connect with it, but it absolutely blew my mind. Um, it does such a good job. So yes, there is a time loop. There are subtle suggestions that it's not a perfect time loop in the sense that if the character doesn't figure out the puzzle as you describe it, bad things will happen. There's a subtle hint of decay as the loops keep going, and it's really ominous and really it got to me at least. And then also, once the character thinks that she's solved the puzzle and she's like, oh, cool, I'm ready. Let's go, time loop. Let's do it again. I am going to get in there and I'm going to solve things. Right then, it's dramatically not the exact same time loop. It's like, oh, twist, you thought you knew what was going on? Well, screw you. Like, you don't know nothing. You have still so much character growth to go. Like, you're not ready yet for this. So I think that, planning out as an author, where are your twists? Where do they come in? What are the things? Because a danger is the repetition,
Hmm.
is the boredom of your reader. So, where do you screw with your character, and how do you screw with your character? And there's any number of million different ways that you can answer that, and that's for the author to figure out. um,
That is such a good point because ultimately, and I could see how this could be an easy trap for someone that's trying out time loops, is they find themselves repeating things to the point where the viewer or the reader is struggling. And you need to be able to like account for that.
yeah, I think you really got to balance carefully what repetition do you have because it's absolutely essential. It's part of the story. And even in exceptionally small doses, potentially boring the reader.
Mm,
But, you got to be so careful with that. Doing it for emphasis for the sake of the story versus, okay, yes, the character is bored, maybe. Their experience is looping, but there's got to be something different. And I mean, ultimately, the answer is you bring it back to the character because they are the element that carries with them actual experience of the loop. They are able to actively choose to do something different on each next iteration. And, Groundhog Day and Edge of Tomorrow and these other ones that many people are familiar with, at least, you you're going to try different things. That character is going to base their next experience on their previous one. So making sure you have logic to what would this character do in the time loop? Not just anybody, but your particular character. Um, I don't know. My advice for all writers is you got to start with who is your character and are they someone who's interesting enough to follow for a novel length, if that's what you're writing story.
that's great advice. A question that plagues all of us for all stories, but I could see how time loops is particularly challenging.
Yeah, I think so. I think so for time loops.
Okay, so my next questions are kind of more putting ourselves in the role of the protagonist, kind of applying a real world perspective to it. So, how much do you think is realistically reasonable to accomplish in a set time loop? For example, can you realistically get someone to fall in love with you in one day?
Yeah, so that I mean, and for anybody who's not seen it, that's almost certainly a reference to Groundhog Day, I
Yes.
assume.
Yes.
Um, so I think it's a really interesting question, and I didn't see the Flash movie, like I said, but I really love the idea that he just can't change, this thing that is his core, like it's his purpose is to change this one thing, and he just can't. Because again, that resonates with our real lives. We want so badly for whatever to be different, and we just can't change some stuff about our lives. I think that it is a doom and gloom a little bit. Hopefully that one was presented as like, okay, I've accepted my grief and had this,
Yeah.
character
Yes.
growth. But I think investigating what can't be changed is a really fascinating angle on it. Because certainly a lot of things can't be. But at the same time, 24 hours is, and it's 24 hours where you're thrown into, where exactly, who knows where exactly. And it might be not a situation where you have a lot of leverage
Yeah.
over things big or broad or distant. Edge of Tomorrow, the character keeps waking up, you know, handcuffed on the tarmac of some airfield,
Yeah.
and drill sergeant kicks him in the side, says, get up, maggot.
Yep.
Um, that's a weak starting place um, for your time loop, which is good because it
Mhm.
it really makes it a challenge for the character to affect meaningful change. Um, I don't know. I'm avoiding the question, honestly.
I
Right?
think this is where artistic license in fiction comes in. Um,
Absolutely.
I just keep thinking about in the case of Groundhog Day specifically, you have a man who is trying to get the favor of this woman, but he has the equivalent of like a really long time to get to know everything about her. And so if you flip the script and you look at it from her angle, she's only known him for less than a day, but he has way more information on her, and the free will on her part feels like it's lacking. So, I guess the way I think about this question is no, you can't get someone to
No,
fall in
yeah.
love with you in one day. But can you use your time loop to within a day come to terms with whatever grief or circumstances or mindset you're in and then become a better person as a result and not change anything in the end? Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Right. Right. And I think this gets to the moral of many of the time loops that we've read and seen, which is that, I mean, I think a big resonant with the time loops is what do we do with the time that we have in our own lives, which in some ways is very repetitive? How do we find meaning in our repetitive days if our day is get up, sit in traffic, go to work, sit in traffic, go home, do chores, go to bed? Like, if that's our day, how do we find meaning in that? Um, and that's just a profound question that many of us have to live with. And time loops can sort of help us with that while at the same time indulging in a little bit of the fantasy of like, haha, but there's no consequences.
That's right. Like,
um,
I'm the writer, I control this world.
Absolutely, right? So I do think there are significant limitations on what you can and can't change, and you as an author absolutely use your artistic license to decide what sort of story are you telling and what is the message that you either want to communicate or you're trying to communicate, and that answers that question. Because I think that uh, another just curiosity I have is the butterfly effect, which is a small change can have a large outcome. However, the butterfly effect is also applied over a long time period. It's not
Mhm.
like immediately your small change has a big outcome. It's over a long period of time. So with a 24-hour time loop, who the heck knows? If it was a time loop where it's almost like a reincarnation thing, where you have to like be literally born again and go through, baby and youth and adult and puberty and adulthood over that amount of time, I think it would be very interesting to look at how small little changes affect big outcomes.
Okay, you talked about seeing yourself in time loops because we live time loops every day. My next question is kind of related to that. It is, what kind of time loop, what kind of fictional time loop can you most realistically see yourself stuck in?
Right. So the short answer is the boring one, which is the one that I am stuck in, which
Mhm.
thankfully I don't have to drive to work every day, but when I do, I hate driving, and then I'm like frequently thinking like I could do this job from home. And even if I was at home though, it's a very repetitive time loop. So there's of course the mundane time loop that we're all sort of stuck in our own version of.
Mhm.
However, on the other hand, can I imagine myself in some sort of military science fiction time loop? Yeah, because I play video games. I like playing video games. I intentionally insert myself into a military science fiction time loop because it's very empowering and it's just fun and there's no consequences to it, right?
Mhm.
So, um, and I'll use this opportunity to mention again The Outer Wilds, which is a video game, but it is not. I mean, most video games, they're not about a time loop. It's just that, oh, you have, you have extra lives and you can replay the game as many times as you want. It's just
Mhm.
that aspect of it is reminiscent of a time loop. And Edge of Tomorrow is based on the novel All You Need Is Kill, which the author has said is very much inspired by video games. But the Outer Wilds is not that sort of game. There is, and this is already a little tiny spoiler for the game, there is explicitly a time loop in the game itself. You have, and I don't remember if it's like 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, but you have some limited amount of time before the game forcibly resets you and
Oh,
makes you play from the beginning. Yeah, right. And
wow.
so it's and it is a puzzle to be solved,
Yeah.
right? What you do in the game is you explore the world in the time that you have, and you try to figure out the central mystery and figure out what's going on. Why is time looping? And it is an incredible experience. I will not spoil any more other than to tell you about the vibes. The graphics are sort of very adorable, very cute. Um, and then, shocker, existential horror right out of right field. It really makes you think about like life and death and the time we have and how your loved ones won't always be with you. And like it's just a
Oh, wow.
profoundly moving experience. It's pretty intense for what on its surface looks like a very peaceful and sort of like lighthearted uh, game. But
Oh,
it's
now
it,
I want to
it's one of
play it.
it's one of those games as art. Like nobody should argue that games aren't art anymore. That's a
Yeah.
ridiculous standpoint to hold, and this is definitely one of them that
Okay.
is
Well,
up
now
there.
I'm intrigued and I want to have that same experience.
Well, I
So,
hope other people intrigued. It's if anybody just comes away with only some recommendations, Russian Doll, Outer Wilds, you will not regret it. I mean, well, some of you will regret it, but a minority. The rest of you will really get into them.
okay. Do you have any final advice for writers? They're like, okay, I'm inspired now. I want to write a time loop, or I've been thinking about a time loop, and now I need to know where to start. What's some advice that you have for them?
Gosh, I'm trying to think of what to say that I haven't said already. I think that thinking about both why is this character going to be moved by a time loop, personally moved, is question one. I think thinking about your ending, how and why do they break out of the time loop? And also, like, I mean, we've been talking about stuff that is to the point of tropey. Uh, uh, I mean, Groundhog Day absolutely doesn't make any effort to explain why this person's in a time loop. There's few people less deserving of the redemption of a time loop as the character in that movie. Um, and you don't have to explain too much. I think, science fiction needs to give some sort of hand wavy explanation. But, a movie like that is mostly just a comedy, doesn't really need to. But like, why does this character need this experience? I mean, Groundhog Day, honestly, and this just came to me, feels like it was very much inspired by um, a Christmas Carol. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol,
Hmm.
because that character is not put into a time loop, of course, but shown past, present, and future, right? And it's very much also a character who's not deserving of redemption. Scrooge is a bad guy,
Hmm.
which is why it's all the more powerful when he has his redemption arc. I think also having fun with it is absolutely essential, right? That power trip, or even it doesn't have to be a power trip. The just the emotional weight of being able to right our own wrongs is so powerful that the the part of the story where they become sort of a master of their own universe can, I think, have a lot of emotional weight, whether it's a power trip or whether it's sort of an emotional trip, I guess, a sort of a charity trip, maybe, if you will. That maybe makes that you gotta be careful. You don't want to have the character arc too soon. You gotta have at the proper point. Thinking about your twists, thinking about there's a variety of time loop stories without mentioning any specifics that surprise yank away the time looping ability. Suddenly it's last chance, right? You got to get it right this time or
Yeah.
never. And
Hmm.
that's it's, I mean, it's been done so much that maybe it's a little bit seen coming, but I think it's still a worthy and potentially quite impactful twist to throw at your character.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Neil, for joining me. This has been a fantastic conversation. I always enjoy talking about time travel, time looping, ways that we can help our characters grow and develop, how different plot devices and story structures aid in that development. So it's nice to be able to unpack this one with you. All right. Any final remarks before we say bye?
No, thanks for having me. I hopefully someday I'll get to tell viewers about the work in progress that I'm working on right now. In the meantime, my novel that's out is Crew of Exiles, and I hope I have a timeline to have another one out by the end of 2025. Also, not a time loop, but a real good one.
Very
So look
exciting.
for that.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in this week. We will see you next week. I'll talk to you later. Bye.